Hello, welcome to Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. I am Robert the Narrator, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Confessions. Well, this is episode number 36, and it will be my last episode in my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time series. And that puts us at game number one! That's right. We have reached game number one of my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time. And that RPG is. Huh? What? You. What? You need me? Yeah, babe, I'm gonna go back to making my video. They've been waiting for this for like a year or something. I guess they can wait a little bit longer. It doesn't matter. Just kidding, guys. I'm sorry. That was really horrible of me to do. But the number one game on my list of top 10 favorite RPGs of all time. I was just kidding with all of that. And that game is Earth Dawn First Edition by the FASA Corporation. And this is not a first edition copy. I no longer own a first edition. I'm thinking about getting the first edition copy. This is third edition Game Master's Guide, and they came as a Game Master's Guide and a player's handbook, a player's guide. But yeah, Earth Dawn First Edition is my favorite RPG of all time. It was released in 1993. So what drew me to the game? I first came across the game from a pamphlet that FASA released. And it was the first time I had ever seen a game use all of the polyhedral dice to represent attributes. They used D4, D6, D8, D10, and D12. They didn't use D20, but that was the first time I had ever seen a role-playing game do that. So I was really interested in checking the game out. And it was also FASA's first fantasy RPG. Of course, FASA is known for their classic role-playing game Shadowrun. And Earth Dawn was kind of a prehistory for the Shadowrun setting. And that really interests me. So what is Earth Dawn all about? Well, Earth Dawn is about heroes reclaiming their fantasy world after a cataclysm called the Scourged has ravaged it for over 500 years. The setting gives the world a good reason for being dotted with dungeons filled with monsters and treasures. Like other fantasy games, sometimes it doesn't quite make sense that this world is just filled with otherwise empty dungeons with just treasure and monsters in it, but Earth Dawn gives a really good reason for that to be the case. So what is the setting for Earth Dawn? Well, as I said, it's a fantasy RPG. It's high fantasy, and the game starts 500 years after this event called the Scourge. The game focuses on a province called Barsave. Barsave is approximately 40 days travel from east to west and about 50 to 60 days travel by horseback from north to south. In the setting, magical energy goes through cycles of being high and low. These cycles last for hundreds of years. And the scourge occurs when the level of magical energy in the world is at the highest level ever. Now, this allows the most malevolent and powerful entities known to this world to cross out of their astral space realm into the real world, because the magical level is so incredibly high. The horrors are so powerful and so evil that the name giver races, that's what they call the player races in Earth Dawn, the name givers, because they name things, and giving things names gives power to them. The name giver races have no other choice but to flee into hiding before the scourge begins. They hide in rune protected underground lairs. They seal themselves inside of mountains. As a matter of fact, the elves who occupy an area called Wormwood know that horrors feed off of pain, but the horror has to cause the pain that they're feeding off of. So the elves, in a desperate effort, perform a ritual that causes thorns to grow out of their flesh, causing them constant suffering. But this protects them from the horrors. These elves were called blood elves. Some horrors used brute force to penetrate name giver hiding places. Some possessed or corrupted inhabitants. And this is one really fantastic aspect of the setting, and we'll talk a little bit about this when I talk about character creation. But every person who lives in Barsave, when they're born, they are taught an artisan skill. And during character creation, you have to choose an artisan skill. It could be something like singing, dancing, carving, anything like that, because it is believed that someone who is tainted or possessed by a horror cannot create things of beauty like paintings or carvings or do beautiful poetry. So you are taught an artisan skill and required to perform it every so often to prove that you are not tainted by these evil entities called horrors. Earth Dawn is definitely a high fantasy setting. They have airships and sky raiders who pilot them across the skies. They have what are called blood charms, which are magical items that are powered by the user's blood. Like they have blood pebble armor, which is hundreds of elemental stones embedded in the person's skin and powered by their blood. And a person would wear that just as they would wear any other type of mundane or traditional armor. Or they could have blood weapons which replace the person's part of the person's anatomy with a living crystal item that enhances their unarmed damage. So as you can see, the game is a very high magic, high fantasy setting. And one aspect of the game that I have always loved are the magical treasures or magical items that player characters can find. Because unlike a lot of other fantasy games, when you find a magical treasure or magical item in Earth Dawn, you don't just pick the item up and start using it. Before you can unlock the power of magical items, you actually have to research, study, and understand that item's history in the world. So it's not a matter of killing creatures and taking their stuff, because you have to work to unlock the treasures that you find or that you steal. Just to give you an idea, most magical items have what are called key knowledges. I'll give you an example. You have a magic item in the game called Bracers of Eris. Bracers of Eris are made of flexible, silvery metal, wraps around the wrist and forearms of the wearer. The flexibility is a result of the elemental water that has been forged into the bracers. The elemental water pieces used in crafting the bracers resembles aquamarine gems, each piece approximately 1 inch in diameter. And the Bracers of Ares has 5 different key knowledges which unlock increased power for the item. For the first key knowledge, it says each set of bracers is named by their creator. The wearer must learn the name of the bracers. So at that first key knowledge, if you find that information out, the bracer's powers are activated and the wearer's physical defense is increased by 1. We'll talk about that later on. Then, the second key knowledge, the wearer must learn the name of the mine from which came the metals used to create the bracers. And that gives the wearer, once they find that information out, the wearer's spell defense is increased by 1. I love this aspect of the game. If you want to be a murder hobo, you at least are going to learn about the setting as you go about trying to unlock the magical abilities of these magical treasures or items that you find. And this is the world that the players find themselves in. Magical energy has lowered enough to force the most powerful horrors back into astral space. And it is a world that has been under siege for 5 centuries. The major cities have reopened, and Barsave's inhabitants are trying to reclaim what has been lost, because many communities have been lost. And again, it gives a great reason for this fantasy world to be dotted with empty dungeons, or at least dungeons that are only inhabited by magical treasure and monsters. It gives a great reason for that, because some of the hiding places were penetrated by horrors and the inhabitants were either tainted, driven insane, or murdered. What is character creation like for Earth Dawn? There are 8 name giver races for players to play. Some of them are your usual suspects and some of them are fairly unique. You have dwarves, you have elves, you have humans, you have obsidian, who are living rock creatures. You have orcs, trolls, Tuskrang, Tuskrang are lizard men with long, powerful tails. And you have windlings, which are winged creatures that stand only 18 inches high. They weigh about 13 pounds and they can fly. So as I said, some usual suspects, but then some unique races like Obsidian and Tuskrang you usually don't see. I've never seen living rock creatures as player characters in a fantasy game, and very seldom do you see lizard men or very small winged folk. Player characters in Earth Dawn are called adepts. Adepts are the individuals who go out into the setting and try to reclaim this ravaged world. The adventurers, the adepts, are very skilled. They're more powerful, of course, than the common folk. And adepts use a great deal of magic in their adventuring. The first part of character creation is for a player to choose his adept's discipline. And essentially, disciplines are character classes. The disciplines that you can choose from is Air Sailor. It's a sailor who of course plies his trade on the airships, very swashbuckling type character. You have Archer, Beastmaster, who interacts with animals in the wilderness. You have a cavalryman who starts with a horse. He rides a horse into battle. You have Elementalist, which is one of the spellcaster disciplines. Illusionist, another spellcaster discipline. Nethermancer, another spellcaster discipline. Nethermancers deal with other planes of existence and spirits. You have a Scout, who is basically your ranger type. You have a Sky Raider, who is more of the piratey type operator of sky ships. You have a Sword Master, Thief, Troubadour, who's kind of the bard discipline for Earth Dawn. You have a Warrior. You have a Weaponsmith. Weaponsmiths, of course, specialize in maintaining weapons and identifying weapons and so forth. And you have Wizards, who's the final spellcasting discipline. What makes Adepts so special is things in the game that would normally be considered skills, like a melee weapon skill or range weapon skills, are powered by magic for the adept. And the difference is, with mundane skills, of course, you have to practice, you have to find a teacher, and you have to spend money in a lot of cases to train and improve or learn skills. But as an adept, those skills are powered by magic. So once you have enough experience, you can actually learn or increase those magical skills, which they call talents, with meditation. So it makes adepts very different to the normal folk in the world. Once you have chosen your discipline, you then have to choose one of the player races. Choosing a player race gives you is your starting attribute values. Now, as you probably guessed it, Earth Dawn has attributes very similar to Dungeons and Dragons. You have dexterity, strength, toughness, perception, willpower, and charisma. And they are on the same scale as you would find in Dungeons and Dragons. 10 is average human capability. Below 10, you start to dip into below average human competence. And above 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, you become more and more extraordinary and above average. So it's the same scale that you may be used to from games like Dungeons and Dragons. So picking your race gives you your starting attribute scores. Elves start with a dexterity of 12, a strength of 10, a toughness of 8, a perception of 11, a will of 11, and a charisma of 11. So they're above average in dex, perception, willpower, and charisma, and average in strength and below average in toughness. And Obsidian, for example, the living rock creatures, start with a dexterity of 8, a strength of 18, a toughness of 13, a perception of 9, a willpower of 10, and a charisma of 9. Now the character receives 25 points to modify their starting attribute values. You have a small chart here that shows you what the cost for an increase to an attribute would be. So to increase an attribute +1 cost 1 of these 25 attribute points. +2 costs 2. +3 to an attribute costs 3 points. +4 costs 5 points. +5 costs 7 points. +6 costs 9 points. +7 costs 12 points. And +8 costs 15 points. You can also choose to lower attributes. A -1 to your starting attribute gives you +1 attribute point. A -2 gives you a +2. to the attribute points that you have to spend. So you spend 25 points to increase those starting values. Once you have finalized your attributes, they determine a great deal of things about your character. And of course, this affects the core mechanic of the game. So sometimes you'll hear folks complain that ability scores in Dungeons and Dragons don't mean anything. Once you have your ability score, that translates into a modifier, and the modifier is the only thing that's really important. And after that, the ability scores pretty much don't mean anything. Well, I have to say that Earth Dawn has doubled down on the idea of having something that is useless when it comes to ability or attribute scores, because your final attribute value translates into what is called a step number. And the step number that the attribute score translates into a particular polyhedral dice. So they've added an additional step to the process of figuring out what you have to roll when you're doing tasks in the game. The easiest way to think of the step number that your attribute value translates into is that step number is the average of whatever die the step number translates into. So just to give you an example, if you have an attribute value of 10, that translates into step number 5, and step number 5 gives you a D8. So the average roll on a D8 is 5. So whenever you wanted to do something with your strength, you would roll a D8 and you go against a fixed target number determined by the game master. So that gives you a little taste of what the core task resolution mechanic for the game is. The other things that your final attribute values determine, not only do they determine your step number, and that step number tells you what die you roll, but it also gives you your physical, spell, and social defenses. You can think of these as like armor classes in Dungeons and Dragons. When someone physically attacks you, punching, kicking, stabbing, firing a crossbow bolt at you, they want to roll against your physical defense. When someone is casting a spell against you, they want to roll against your spell defense, and they want to roll equal to or higher than that defense. Whenever someone is trying to convince you of something or use their charisma or influence you, they want to roll against your social defense. So a character with a 10 in their dexterity would have a physical defense of 6. If a character had a 15 in perception, they would have a spell defense of 8. Or if they had an 8 in their charisma, they would have a social defense of 5. So you would record that number, and for instance, the character with the D8 for dexterity, if he was going to fire a weapon at you, he would need to roll a 6 or higher to hit. So the attribute value also determines what your defenses are going to be. Your attribute value tells you what your carrying capacity will be, and that is of course based on whatever your strength is. Then for your toughness, it tells you what your death rating is, how much damage your character can take before they die. They tell you what your unconsciousness rating is. Of course, tells you when your character is knocked unconscious. And your wound threshold, which tells you how many increments of damage you can take before you are wounded. And also, your toughness value tells you how many recovery tests you can take per day. Because after resting, you can spend what's called a recovery check. Essentially, you roll your toughness and you lose that amount of damage. Now what you want to do is record your racial abilities. For instance, Wendlings have astral sight, so they can see into the astral plane and they can fly. To Scrang can do combat with their tails, where they can attack with their tails, and some T-Scrang actually attach melee weapons to their tails and use those for attacking. Obsidian have Obsidian skin, which gives them a physical armor rating of 3. Elves have low light vision. You would want to go ahead and write those racial abilities down in this step of the process. And next, you want to assign talent ranks and spells. The adepts use magic for a lot of what mundane folks would call just skills. And these magical skills are called talents. Your discipline tells you what talents you have access to. The game has levels, but in Earth Dawn they call levels circles. So a first circle character will have a list of talents that they can put ranks into. Just to give you an example, an archer, a first circle archer, has Karma Ritual, missile weapons, Mystic Aim, throwing weapons, and True Shot as talents that they have access to. A weaponsmith has the Evaluate talent, Forge Weapon, Haggle, Karma Ritual, and Steel Thought. Just to give you an idea what karma is, it's basically like action points. They are points that a character can use to boost or add dice to certain actions to improve their chances of success. And a karma ritual for disciplines are rituals that adepts can do to regain karma. Looking at the weaponsmith here, the weaponsmith's karma ritual is to perform his karma ritual. The weaponsmith heats a thin strip of metal in a hot fire or forge. Over the next half hour, he fashions the metal into a blade, arrowhead, or spear tip, but instead of forging an effective item, he intentionally tempers the metal too soon, making it brittle. The weaponsmith then shatters the defective piece of metalwork. The ritual ends the instant the item breaks. This is really awesome, very flavorful. Every discipline has a different way of performing their karma ritual to get karma back. These action points that adepts can use. I think the scout is blindfolded and has to get led into the wilderness, and then he takes the blindfold off and has to find his way back to camp. And when he does, his ritual is over and he can get some of those action points, the karma, back. I really love that aspect of the game. But back to talents. You purchase ranks in those talents, and those ranks are added usually to the attribute when you're attempting an action. For example, the missile weapons talent uses dexterity, and the ranks that you put into your missile weapon talent would add to your dexterity when you're making an attack check. You receive 8 rank points to assign to the talents your character starts the game with. Each point assigned to a talent improves the talent by +1 rank. You may assign up to 3 rank points to a talent for a maximum starting rank of 3. These talents are essentially ways to boost the attributes that are used with the talent, giving you a better chance of success. Adepts also have mundane skills that aren't powered by magic, and they receive 8 rank points to distribute freely among the 4 skill categories, which are knowledge, artisan, language, and general skills. We already talked about the artisan skills, and a character receives 1 free rank in the artisan skill chosen from their discipline. Then if you are a magic using character, you also have to purchase your spells. You have a number of spell points equal to your perception step. At first circle, you can purchase first circle or second circle spells. First circle spells cost 1 of those spell points. Second circle spells cost 2 spell points. Now, I really love this aspect of Earth Dawn as well. I love the way they do magic. The way magic is done in Earth Dawn is there are 3 different ways that you can cast a spell in Earth Dawn. The safest way is to cast a spell from what's called a spell matrix. Spell matrices are astral constructs that filter raw magical energy through them so that the energy does not harm the spellcaster. You can attune one spell to the matrix and you can safely cast that spell from that matrix, and there's a process to reattune. So if you wanted to swap out spells, you can do that. It's not easy, but you can do that. The second way is to cast it from your grimoire. It's a little bit slower, and you are channeling the magical energy through your grimoire, which could damage your grimoire, but it is safer than the final option for spell casting, which is raw magic, where you're not casting from a matrix or from your grimoire. You are filtering the magical energy from astral space through your body. And I really love this aspect of the game because depending on the corruption level in the area that you're casting this raw magical spell, you can take a lot of damage or you can get marked by a horror, because casting raw magic is like sending a signal flare into astral space, which could catch the attention of one of these very evil, very powerful entities in astral space, and they could do damage to you or they could mark you, which allows them to directly affect you with their abilities. I've always loved this aspect of Earth Dawn. Sometimes I like the idea that casting spells is just like someone firing an arrow or swinging a sword. There really aren't any negative effects, but every once in a while I like a system that treats spell casting a little differently from firing a crossbow, where there are some complications and magic feels special. That part of Earth Dawn is one of my favorite things. But once you have assigned your talent and spells, if you're a magic user, you assign your skill ranks, you equip your character, you flesh them out as far as personality, background, and moral beliefs, and you're ready to play the game. I think the last thing that I will cover is the core task resolution mechanic for the game. I've already told you about step numbers. I've told you about talents and skills, which those ranks are added to your step numbers to boost them and allow you to roll more dice. So just to give you an example, a lot of the time, especially when you're attacking, you're going to be attacking a target's fixed defense, like physical defense for mundane attacks, spell defense for casting magic against them, or social defense when you're trying to persuade or intimidate them. So in that example where we had the character with the step 5 for their dexterity, a d8, let's say they had 4 ranks in missile weapons. So that would add to their step 5. That gives them step 9. Step 9, we have a little chart here, is a d8 plus a d6. So that's the average. The step number 9 is the average roll of a d8 and a d6. If they were firing at a target with, say, a physical defense of 6, they would roll the d8 and the d6, add the numbers together, and they want to roll equal to or higher than 6. So I'll roll a d8 and a d6 and see what I get. So I'm rolling here. Boom, I have an 11. That would be a hit. In the game, all dice explode. And this is the reason for that, because there are levels of success. you have a pathetic, poor, average, good, excellent, and extraordinary. So the difficulty number 6, a pathetic result would be a 1, a poor result would be 2 or 5, an average result would be 6 or 8, a good result would be a 9 or 12, an excellent result would be a 13 or 16, and an extraordinary result would be a 17 plus. If you make the roll by 10 or more, it's an extraordinary success, and you get particular bonuses for achieving good, excellent, and extraordinary successes on your rolls. And that core task resolution mechanic is the same for times when you are not attacking, when you're trying to jump from rooftop to rooftop. That would also be dexterity. And in that case, the game master would determine a target number, and you would roll, and you would see what type of success you would get. Very simple, very straightforward. Well, that is Earth Dawn, my favorite role-playing game of all time. I'm so happy that I could share that with you. I've loved this game for many, many years. As I mentioned in my last episode, game number 2, Champions, which is actually the role-playing game that got me into the hobby, the reason it is not number 1 is because during my time in the hobby, I felt like Champions was too rules heavy for me, and there have been times when I refused to play the game because now I am much more in the rules medium camp, and I really don't like rules heavy games. I think Earth Dawn is a high rules medium or low rules heavy game. But despite that fact, I have never shunned Earth Dawn. I love the setting and the concepts and the mechanics so much that I've never not wanted to play. For my Ivan Mike protocol, I think I would say that if you love a rich setting that does things a little differently from other fantasy role-playing games out there, and you don't mind a little bit of rules heft, Earth Dawn is a fantastic game, and I definitely would run it for a group that wanted to experience Earth Dawn. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. Thank you for joining me for this series of my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time. It is so great to have this completed. I think I want to do a couple of follow-up episodes, or maybe one follow-up episode, to talk about the also-rans, other games that I really love that didn't make my top 10 list, and how I feel about the list in general. Thanks again for joining me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are.